Hi everyone. Um, just making sure you guys can hear me. So thank you everyone for attending this session virtually. We have a great lineup today, so I'm excited that we can go through with this. I hope everyone is staying safe. So the session is on religion and culture, and we have three presenters. So I'll start first. So my name is Eduardo Montero, professor at the University of Michigan. Then we'll have Heyu Xiong from Case Western, and then Arthur Blouin from the University of Toronto. So I'm the moderator, and so I get to pick, so I'll go first. But I'll talk for 15 minutes, and then there's a Q&A function where people can submit questions, and I'll choose which ones to ask myself and then answer to you guys. But hopefully this goes smoothly, and thank you guys for coming. So let me just make sure my screen is sharing. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see it, and if not, send me a message and we can figure it out. But today I'm here to talk about this paper that's joint work with Dean Young, also at the University of Michigan. That's titled Religious Festivals and Long-Run Development, Evidence from Catholic Saint Day Celebrations in Mexico. And it comes from this striking fact that's very common in developing countries, which is that people living with less than $1 a day have been documented to spend large amounts of their incomes on religious festivals. So Banerjee and Duflo in their book Poor Economics highlight a few examples, which is in Morocco, individuals living with less than $1 a day tend to spend about 10% of their monthly budget on festivals, which is a staggering amount. And another example is that in Udaipur, India, individuals living with under $1 a day spend 14% of their monthly budget on festivals. And these festivals are very prevalent across the world. So these are just a few examples. A very famous one is the Carnival in Brazil. Less famous one, but closer to my home, is these mascaradas in Costa Rica, where the government throws these big parties and people make these elaborate masks and dance around for days. And so these festivals often involve large expenditures by households, but also by governments. And so these festival expenditures play a really important role in the lives of the poor. And there's been this debate on whether these religious festivals are beneficial or detrimental for long run growth in particular. So one argument is that these festivals may improve development because these expenditures may lead to more social capital. That's what we think religious festivals tend to do. And that might ultimately spur more growth. On the flip side, these festivals may be detrimental to development. These expenditures may actually crowd out other long-run investments as resources are consumed instead. However, there isn't a lot of empirical evidence on the impacts of these religious practices. And this is for three reasons. So the first one is, I'm sure everyone is familiar with, is that basically these festivals are not assigned exogenously across individuals or across geographic areas. They evolve endogenously. But two other things make this question quite difficult, which is that first, these festivals often affect an entire country at the same time. So think about something like Christmas that affects a whole country at the same time, making it difficult to get variation in this practice. The second thing is that it's also difficult to study long-term effects. A lot of these papers have studied countries, comparing countries across time, but looking at the short-run effects of if a religious festival occurs 1 month earlier than another country, what happens? But this makes it difficult to answer this question about, in the long run, how does this affect development? And so to make progress on this, we investigate the impact of a particular religious festival in Mexico, which is these Catholic Saint Day festivals. So I'm going to explain briefly what these are and then what we do. So in Mexico, and in many Roman Catholic countries, towns celebrate the saint day of a holy figure associated with the town, also known as the patron saint. And these celebrations involve substantial financial expenditures by households and local governments. And we combine two features of the context, which is that these festivals vary greatly across Mexico, across municipalities, and they're determined in the early history of the towns during the Spanish conquest of Mexico. And the second thing we'll take advantage of is that there's considerable variation in the intra-annual timing of the main agricultural seasons across Mexico. What this means is that we'll use the following empirical strategy. We'll compare municipalities where their festival happens to overlap with planting season or harvest season to municipalities that have a festival that doesn't overlap with these two agricultural seasons to study the long-term impacts of these festivals on economic development and social outcomes. And so the research questions we hope to ask, and basically laying out the roadmap for this presentation, is first, how does festival timing affect development across Mexico? So we collect archival and interview-based records to create this data set of saint days across Mexican municipalities. We'll use this data and combine it with data on the optimal planting and harvest dates for crops across Mexico to create measures of whether these festivals overlap with planting or harvest. And as our outcome, we'll look at an index of census development outcomes, just a number of different things we'll look at. And then we'll turn to the flip side of religious festivals. So people argue that these festivals can be quite good for social capital. So we'll explore this question using America Barometer survey data and examine differences in trust and group membership to study both these effects. How does it affect development and how does it affect social capital? If I have time, and we do this in the paper a bit, is what are the mechanisms for these differences in development and social capital? We analyze a few historical outcomes and agricultural outcomes to try to pin down the effects we see. But I probably won't get to that today, just to keep it short. I'll focus on questions 1 and 2. So let me just give you guys some background on these Catholic saint days in Mexico. So these saint day festivals are yearly celebrations that occur in Catholic countries, but especially those influenced by Spanish culture. So they're really prevalent in Latin America, for example. And they're usually dedicated to a saint or virgin who is determined to be the patron of a given locality. So there's hundreds of such celebrated saint days across the calendar year, and these dates are set by the Catholic hierarchy in the Vatican, and they've been pretty consistent for the last 500 years. And to give you guys an example, today, the day we're hosting this virtual conference, March 13th, is St. Christina's Day. So if your town happens to celebrate St. Christina, today you'd be having a big party. And so according to the Catholic Church, these saints are believed to protect people and by extension their communities. So they're desirable for these communities. And so how were these saints selected? So there's a big difference between Europe and Latin America that we kind of explored for this paper. So in Spain, these patron saints were chosen by their town or locality, looking to protect their community and the individual members of that community. So they get to choose their patron saint historically. In Mexico and most of Latin America, though, patron saints were typically established at the time of the town's founding by Spanish colonizers, often centuries ago. And in particular, there were 3 main ways that these saints were chosen by Spanish colonizers to represent their communities. So the first is using military conquest dates, and I'll talk about that next. And then the second and third ways are trying to think about similarities between the saint and the community and their characteristics, or the saint and the indigenous gods of their community. And I'll talk about that in 2 slides. So the first way that saints were often chosen is through these military conquests. So initially, many patron saints were assigned by the Spanish following military victories that prompted them to choose their first patron saint. So for example, if they had a military victory on a given date, they often chose the saint that represents that date to be the date of the town. Characteristics of the military actions undertaken also played a role. So for example, if a particular conquest was really had a lot of battle, then they chose a saint that's associated with a lot of battle. And this still plays a prominent role today in the festival celebrations in Mexico. So figure 5 shows this picture of a modern day festival celebration in Actopan, Veracruz. And as you can see, people are still celebrating using these military conquest features as part of the celebrations. The other ways that saints were chosen, sometimes based on similarity to already worshipped indigenous gods. So oftentimes towns were assigned a saint based on characteristics of their community, functions of the saints, because saints have different functions. So some saints, for example, are known for being very good at cooking. Puebla, a town in Mexico, has really good cuisine, and so they adopted the saint associated with cooking. However, one thing to note is that the selection was based on often functional or symbolic similarities between indigenous gods or communities, rather than the dates of the celebration. So they weren't really strategic. We haven't found much evidence that they were strategic about choosing based on the date. They chose based on the characteristics of the saints, the protection that they offered. And finally, we won't talk about this too much, but there actually are some cases where the saints were chosen at quote unquote random. So in some towns' oral histories, the saints were physically pulled out of a bowl, for example. So they would put all the saints' names in a bowl, pick one, and that would be the town's saint, because the communities there wanted the saints to choose them instead of having them choose the community. So that happened in a few cases, but unfortunately we don't have systematic evidence about this, but that'd be really nice. But again, these saint days are quite important in Mexico. The historians argue that these saint days have served as a contract and where the towns keep up its end by celebrating the saint, and then the saint keeps up to their end by offering protection to these towns. And these Saint Day fiestas often begin and close with a mass in the saint's honor, but in between they involve concerts, fireworks, a lot of food stands, and music for many days. Many cost about $10,000 per community or over that, and the community contributes a lot, so households share a lot of the responsibility. There's a lot of redistribution that goes on, including the mayordomia system. Historically, families would rotate who was most in charge and in charge of organizing. So this is just a picture of a festival today, also in Veracruz. It's the Santa Magdalena Festival. As you can see, it's really massive, a big celebration. But this isn't just important for Mexico. These are really prevalent throughout Latin America, even today. And a really famous example is in Puerto Rico, they have very big festivals that actually last 9 days and involve just celebrations for over 9 days. Peru also has a number of big celebrations. And so these saint days are quite important throughout the world and prevalent today. Let me talk a little bit about the data sources we use for this paper before getting to our main results. So for this paper, we collected data from a number of archival sources and supplemented it with interviews with municipality governments to determine the Saint Day festival date for each municipality in Mexico. The data was in part available through an online data source, this Encyclopedia of Municipalities in Mexico, but the data was incomplete. So again, we had to either use online searches to try to find out what saint was celebrated, or often directly contacting the municipalities in question. And we decided to focus on the New Spain region of Mexico. This was the main administrative unit during the early colonial history before it started to spread out across Mexico. And it was the region that was first conquered by the Spanish. So that gives us some sense that these are perhaps the most quasi-exogenous saint days. And so this is just a map of what the data looks like when we think about the festival dates. So again, this is a map of Mexico in gray, but then colored in is the New Spain region of Mexico. And in the legend, we're showing you the different months of the festivals. And as you can see, they're really spread out across the calendar. There's a ton of variation. It's not spatially concentrated. We combine this data with data on crop planting and harvest dates from the FAO, the Global Agroecological Zones data. This data provides crop growth cycles, planting dates, and yield estimates at a grid cell level across the world, where each grid is about 100 kilometers squared. And so for this paper, we first focus on the planting and harvest cycle for maize, because maize is and has historically been the most important crop across Mexico for agriculture. And so these seasons are the main ones that we think might matter for development or crowding out, for example. But we provide robustness using other crops by focusing on the maximum calorie crop in each municipality. And the results are actually quite similar, because in general, maize is the most calorie granting crop in Mexico. And so what this data looks like at the end is we combine the data that we had on optimal planting dates, optimal harvest dates, and festival dates, and construct measures about whether the festival overlaps or not with the planting date, for example. Here, just showing you a map of how many days it overlaps, and harvest dates. And this is what we'll use in our data. So now let me tell you, given the data, what empirical strategy we decided to use. So to estimate the impacts of these festivals overlapping with the agricultural seasons, we estimate the following specification, where YM is our outcome of interest for municipality M, and our main independent variables of interest are first, whether the festival occurs in the same month as planting for that municipality, or whether the festival occurs in the same month as harvest for that municipality. In the regression, we also include state fixed effects to account for all time invariant differences across states. So we're going to be looking at variation within states, so across municipalities, but within states in Mexico. And then we include, just to make sure the estimated effects are robust, a number of geographic, climatic, and historical controls for each municipality that might have affected development or saint days or harvest dates. And so I'll talk about that in a bit, but just let me talk about what are our hypotheses with this estimating equation. So based on the social science literature, we have two main hypotheses. The first one is that beta is less than 0. That means that having festivals occur during planting, a period where they may crowd out other long-term investments, in particular because liquidity is low and people can't smooth out their consumption and investment, is associated with worse development outcomes. And then on gamma, we actually don't have as strong priors, but we think that harvest times are a time where liquidity constraints aren't as binding. So festivals may also lead to more economic development in other periods when liquidity is higher and there isn't this crowding out effect, such as after harvest. So our main hypothesis is that gamma is going to be greater than beta. We'll explore that in the data. But let me talk about the main identification assumptions for this project. So first, whether a municipality's state overlaps with planting or harvest has to be independent of other features of the municipality that may also affect economic development. One thing to highlight is that this is a different assumption than assuming that festival dates on their own are exogenous. What we're assuming is that the overlap between the festival and the planting seasons or harvest seasons is exogenous. But there are a number of concerns. So first, these festivals may have been strategically placed by the Spanish to avoid planting and harvest in some places, but not others. And these places might be different on a number of characteristics. But two, more broadly, places that have a festival overlap with harvest or planting may differ on other dimensions that may also affect economic development. So let me talk about two tests really briefly that we use to explore these concerns to test whether this assumption is plausible, particularly after controlling for state fixed effects. So first, we examine whether it's less likely that a festival coincides with planting or harvest compared to other months. Basically trying to examine, is there any evidence of strategic placement? And we run a regression where the dependent variable is whether the festival month occurs in a given month for each municipality, and whether the maize planting is that month or not, or the maize harvest is that month or not. And we find no evidence that festivals are more or less likely to overlap with planting and harvest months, suggesting that there wasn't so much strategic placement. The second issue is basically balance. So municipalities that have a festival overlap might just be very different from other municipalities. So to examine this, we estimate our main estimating equation, but looking at a number of different outcomes like geographic, climatic, or historical characteristics. And here I'm just showing you the coefficient plots. So let me just explain this coefficient plot because you'll see something similar throughout the presentation. So the coefficient in red is whether the festival overlaps with planting. The coefficient in blue is whether the festival overlaps with harvest. And here I'm showing you a number of dependent variables that we think might be important for economic development, such as rainfall, land suitability, maize suitability, etc. We find that municipalities where festivals overlap with planting and or harvest are similar in important characteristics. The one exception, and so we'll have to interpret these results carefully, is that municipalities where the festival overlaps with harvest seem to be less suitable for maize. So I'll talk about that. And we tend to focus a bit more on whether the festival overlaps with planting. And there we see a lot of balance, and the differences are small in magnitude as well. So now let me turn to the main results really quickly. So when we look at difference in development, looking at the 2010 population census, we examine this index of economic development, so combine a number of development outcomes to avoid data mining concerns. We see that festivals overlapping with maize planting is associated with significantly lower levels of development. In contrast, festivals overlapping with harvest is not associated with lower levels of development, and we find some weak evidence that it is associated with higher levels of development, though it's not statistically significant once we include geographic controls and colonial controls, in addition to the state fixed effects. But the main effect is basically having festivals overlap with planting is bad for development. One thing we do is we examine whether this overlap is specific to overlapping with the planting month, or are there other months that are bad for developments as well? And what we find interestingly is that the largest estimated effect occurs when the festival happens to exactly overlap with planting. We find negative effects leading up to it as well, but the biggest one is right when it overlaps. And so we take this as evidence that festivals can crowd out investments when they overlap specifically with planting season. So you can think about this kind of as a placebo test, highlighting the mechanism that we think is behind these results. Now, let me just talk about the other main. Yeah?
Sorry, we are just about at the end of time. You have 2 minutes.
Perfect. Okay. So social capital, having the festival overlap with planting is associated with significantly higher social capital. And this is despite the differences in development. Same when we look at meetings and group index membership. So let me just talk about these really briefly and then conclude. So why do festivals increase social capital despite economic differences? So one thing that's important about these festivals is that they serve a redistribution function, even though they have efficiency costs. And so this could explain why these festivals continue to persist despite of their costs. So they have these sort of equity impacts in spite of their efficiency impacts. So just to conclude, We find that having festivals overlap with planting is associated with worse development outcomes. That this is because they crowd out investment. But we find that festivals overlapping with planting is associated with higher social capital. And this may have implications for development more broadly, as these expenditures are common and a sizable feature of the lives of the poor. So thank you. Sorry for going over time. And I appreciate any questions or comments. And so just because I went a bit over time, maybe it's best if we go to the next presenter because I don't see any questions. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can go to Heyu next.
I hope everybody can hear me. It's a little bit confusing how this works.
We can hear you.
Can you guys hear me? Oh, okay, great. All right. Should I get started?
Okay, sure, yes. I've just enabled your video and your audio.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks so much for the organizers for the opportunity to present. My name is Heyu Xiong. I'm a professor here at Case Western Reserve. And today I'll be talking about the effect of religious competition on the history of higher education in the United States. And this is a joint project with Yiling Zhao. There's broad consensus among policymakers and researchers alike that universities and upper tail human capital matter. There's evidence in both the historical as well as modern setting that shows that universities matter for economic growth, for innovation, as well as for upward mobility for those who attend. The motivation for this paper comes from the observation that at a cross-country level, one of the striking aspects of the United States is the strength of its higher education system, both in terms of the sheer number of schools as well as the quality of those institutions. And this is increasingly recognized as a source of comparative advantage. So this paper kind of takes stock of this fact and asks where does American comparative advantage in higher education originates from? In other words, why are there so many colleges in the United States? One might think that this is a modern phenomenon or something that was always true. However, neither is the case. The American lead in higher education was largely established during the 19th century. In this figure, I show the number of colleges established by decade from the period of 1700 to 1934. And here we see that the number of colleges in the United States was fairly stable until the 19th century, when the pace of college construction and college building greatly accelerated. So from the period of 1820 to 1900, over 400 colleges were built. And this represented a sudden expansion of the college infrastructure in the United States. To put that in context, by 1881, there were 43 colleges in the state of Ohio alone, for a population of just 3 million people, while in England, for a population nearly 8 times that size, there were only 4 universities. So more specifically, the research question we try to answer in this paper is what causes sudden, kind of a seemingly disproportionate investment in educational infrastructure in a number of colleges during the 19th century? What were the economic and social forces driving this sudden expansion of the college infrastructure in the 19th century? And to answer this question, we start by documenting some characteristics common to colleges during that time. 19th century American colleges tended to be local enterprises that were privately established. And in many ways, this is still true of American colleges today. One aspect of colleges in the 19th century, which is no longer salient, is the fact they were heavily denominational. By that, I mean colleges had religious and affiliations and ties to a specific religion or denomination that were often very narrowly defined. So you wouldn't have colleges that were just Christian or even Protestants, but you have colleges that are Methodist, Presbyterian, or Congregationalist, for instance. So specific denominations within the broad Protestant umbrella. And this practice really dates back to the colonial times when the primary purpose of college education was to train individuals for religious vocation. So these differences between denominations were really salient because your interpretation of the Bible really mattered. However, to fix ideas, these denomination colleges I'm talking about are not seminaries. They're really early iterations of modern kind of research universities today. If you look at national universities, in the United States, the majority of them were funded as these denominational institutions. Another unique aspect of the United States is the historical absence of state-sponsored religion. This was always true at the federal level, and after 1790, also true at the state level. And during the 19th century, this led to a proliferation of religious denominations and factions that was driven chiefly by two forces. One was the unlimited immigration from Europe during the age of mass migration. The other was the occurrence of these indigenous religious movements, such as the Second Great Awakening, which we will discuss in more detail in this paper, that gave birth to new denominations and also shifted the religious composition of the local religious competition. So combining these two facts, we essentially arrive at our hypothesis, which is that denominational competition and the diversity and religious diversity, which proliferated during the 19th century, facilitated the provision of higher education and had unintended consequences for the growth of higher education in the United States. And the goal of this paper will be to provide empirical evidence for this hypothesis, and our analysis proceeds in several steps. I will try to give a brief overview and a roadmap of what we do in this paper now. So first, we conduct our analysis at the county level. To do so, we build a kind of a new panel data set on American colleges in the 19th century, as well as a degree of local religious fragmentation from 1850 to 1890. And we do so by using several primary as well as secondary sources. Using this data set, we provide evidence on a robust positive empirical relationship between the local religious fragmentation and the number of colleges in the county that were established in any given decade. We try to address identification concerns as well as indigeneity concerns by using by controlling for competing stories extensively, as well as by the means of several placebo tests. But to make further progress towards causality, we also adopt an instrumental variable strategy at the township level, focusing on a subset of data, particularly focusing on New York State, where we can measure the intensity of the Second Great Awakening, which, as mentioned before, was this nationwide religious movement that really increased the level of religious diversity at a local level. So in New York State, we're able to measure the intensity of this movement, which gave birth to new denominations and increased the level of religious diversity. There, we show that towns where the intensity of the Second Great Awakening was higher, there were greater subsequent developments in a number of colleges. So we show that towns which had quasi-randomly experienced greater intensity of the Second Great Awakening, thereby becoming more religious diverse, also has greater subsequent growth in the number of colleges. Next, we explore the underlying causal mechanism. The credibility of our story essentially relies on the assumption that students prefer to attend a college with a denomination that matched their own, that students actually had a preference for this religious homophily. But this is far from clear. It's very possible that this wasn't a meaningful dimension on which students made college attendance decisions. So to provide evidence on this and to quantify the strength of this preference, we estimate a model of school choice using student microdata collected from largely college yearbooks as well as student biographies. And using the student microdata and by estimating a model of school choice, we show there's both very strong willingness to travel as well as a willingness to pay for denominational homophily, meaning that students were willing to pay a higher tuition as well as they are willing to travel further in order to attend a college that had affiliated to the denomination which matched their students' own denomination. In the very last part of the paper, which is still a work in progress, we explore the broader human capital consequences of this increased entry of number of colleges. So we provide some suggestive evidence thus showing that the increased entry of number of colleges affected the overall college enrollment, meaning more people were able to get to receive a college education, and also that this increased competition might have increased the quality of the institutions. I think broadly speaking, the papers relate to three different strands of literature. For the sake of time, I'll skip the literature review. Here's a brief overview of the rest of the talk. I think because of the time constraint, I'll be largely focusing on the panel results as well, and hopefully discuss the IV strategy as well. So first, we'll just talk a little bit about the data we use at the county level. So one of the first contributions of the paper is constructing a new data set on American colleges from the period of 1850 and to 1890. And we do so by compiling from several primary and secondary sources. Each entry of our data will be a university and at a decade, and it will indicate the location of the university, the denomination of the university, as well as the funding date of when the university was funded. And with this data, we're able to geocode and aggregate everything to the county level, which we then use in our analysis. So first, I just want to kind of show that during this time period, from the period of 1860 to 1895, actually, majority of the colleges existing during this time were denominational and were private. And much of the growth during this time period and the number of colleges were driven by these private denominational colleges, which are shown in the blue line, in the blue line with the on top here. After geocoding and aggregating the data, we then related to information on religious diversity at a local level, also which we construct using the population censuses. The population censuses contain kind of very detailed and rich information on the religious composition at a county level. This includes the number of churches for each denomination. So this includes the number of the denominations that operate in the county, as well as the number of churches for each denomination, as well as the number of seats for each denomination. And using the information and the number of seats available for each denomination, we compute essentially an inverse Herfindahl measure using the denominational seat share. So this will be a measure that will be zero if the county is dominated by one denomination, meaning that one denomination has all the seats in the county, and this will be a measure that's very small if the county is very religiously diverse. It will be close to 1 if the county is very religiously diverse. And that is our main explanatory variable and outcome variable of interest. Here I show here we just want to map and show the extent of religious fragmentation over time. And what we want to emphasize is that there is both variation across space, but also within county variation across time in the degree of religious fragmentation. Notably, we see that the Midwest starts out as being less religiously diverse, and towards the end of the time period become much more so. In contrast, we see that South starts out being moderately religious diverse, but towards the end become much more dominated by evangelical denominations. Our main estimating equations at the county level is as follows. On the left-hand side, we have the log number of colleges in a county I in the year T, and the explanatory variable of interest is a denominational fragmentation as measured by the inverse Herfindahl index in year I at time T. We regress the colleges on denominational fragmentation, accounting for both county as well as year fixed effects, and as well as an extensive set of controls, controlling for the demographic situation of the conditions of the county, the agricultural productivity, the transportation network, as well as the degree of industrialization in the county. Here are the main county level results. We see that throughout six different specifications, including different number of controls, we find a robust and positive relationship between the degree of denominational fragmentation and the number of colleges. Notably, we see that by adding more controls, our coefficients actually remain fairly stable. So this adds to credibility to the idea that our results are not driven by selection on unobservables. The main identification assumption for the county level analysis is that unobservable factors that might simultaneously affect colleges and religious diversity are time invariant. Because of our use of a county fixed effects account for unobservable characteristics that are time invariant. So there are obviously several potential sources of biases which could violate the identification assumption. And I think most of them are categorized as that there are unobservable factors that correlate with the religious diversity that affect the demand for colleges or the cost for building colleges. Our approach for addressing these competing explanations range from just trying to control for as many things as possible, such as the transportation network or the agricultural productivity of the land, but we also conduct several set of falsification tests, which we think add to the credibility of the story. essentially we see that there's no relationship between the degree of religious diversity in a county or and the building of public colleges, of land grant colleges, or of high schools, as well as colleges after 1890. So the positive correlation, the positive relationship we find between religious diversity and the establishment of colleges is limited to private denominational colleges during a time period where we think the mechanism is really salient. Therefore, we think this highlights the mechanism we propose and kind of rule out possible competing explanation. How am I doing on time? Do I have time to go through the?
So I think
Okay,
it's your call. You have about like 3 minutes left. So if you want to, if they're cute, there's no questions yet, but so you can keep presenting. But if people have questions, I can interrupt and ask you the question.
sure. Oh, okay. So I just go through the kind of the IB strategy really quickly. So obviously, one of the kind of the shortcomings of the county level analysis is that ultimately the credibility of our story really comes from what are the channels, what are the forces driving the changes in religious diversity, and whether that's exogenous to factors affecting college building. So, and one of the shortcomings of the county level analysis is that it's not very transparent where the variation in religious diversity is coming from. So so next we turn to essentially instrumental variable strategy where what we're trying to do is isolate exogenous variation in religious composition arising from a natural experiment, which is the Second Great Awakening. This is a religious movement that lasting from 1790 to 1850, and it crucially kind of reshaped the religious composition and increased diversity. So we're going to consider the local intensity of the Second Great Awakening as a source of treatment. So the Second Great Awakening was marked by these religious revivals. So these are, in a sense, kind of religious festivals where influential pastors will be able to convert masses to new denominations and typically outdoor events. So we're going to use the number of revival events at a township level as a source of treatment. And we focus on New York State because New York State was really kind of an epicenter for the Second Great Awakening. And in New York State, we see that religious revivals really kind of peaked in the year 1831. And this is primarily due to the activity of one really influential pastor called Charles Finney, who operated out of Rochester. And the Rochester revival he organized in 1830 was very, very influential, leading to much greater revival activity in the subsequent year. As we could see here, in 1831, the religious revival really peaked in the New York State.
Hey,
so the key is that
there's 1 minute and you have one question. Do you want to take the minute for the question, or do you want to just try to conclude, or?
Yeah, I guess I'll just try to present the IB results and conclude. So
Okay.
the IBs, our instrumental variable strategy will be thinking of the number of revivals in New York State as a form of treatment, and we're going to instrument that with the distance of Rochester, given that religious revivals are not randomly distributed across the state. And essentially what we will find is that counties which exogenously received greater number of revivals and converts in 1831 experienced greater number of colleges greater number of colleges that were built after 1830. So using the IB strategy, we also find a positive relationship between religious diversity and the degree and the intensity of college building. Right. So largely I'll conclude here. So the IB strategy and the county level results are complementary, and both provide evidence for the idea that one of the unintended consequences of religious diversity in the United States was the expansion of the college infrastructure during the 19th.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hey,
Yeah, thank you.
Really great. Cool. And so just the next presenter, right on time, close to it, is Arthur Blouin. So Arthur, I'll let you share your screen and then let you talk. Thanks.
Is this
Yeah, we can see you and see the screen right now.
my slideshow? that okay?
We can't see your slides.
You cannot see my slides. Oh, okay. Interesting. So it says I mean I don't know what to do. It says I'm sharing my screen. I'll stop and start again. Share screen.
Yeah.
So I do see that you are sharing your screen. I do not see your slides though. So is it possible that you have maybe two monitors and that you can move your slides physically?
No, not sure. So you can see my whole, I mean, my slides are in the background of the screen. I don't know what, they're now in the foreground.
Okay. So I can see your screen. I can see the window for this session. I can see you're in the Blue Jeans session. So if you pull your presentation.
So if I minimize, if I kind of can see my desktop background there. Or?
Yeah, I can see your desktop background. I can see your mouse.
And you can see my mouse, but not my slides?
No.
I don't see any slides.
Huh. I don't know. It's okay. So I'll close my slides are just open. I don't know what to.
Are they in full screen? Do you mind minimizing them and making them full screen again?
Okay. Yeah. So I just opened up the PDF. You can see my Finder window kind of in the background here, or not really?
No.
Okay. I'm going to full screen. I said enter full screen. I'm now all I can see on my screen is my slides.
Okay, well, we can't see that. Here's an alternative. What if you send your slides to me? Okay. And then I can.
Yeah.
So how? You want to email them to you? So.
Yes, I think you should do that. To the H2D2 admin account and CC Eduardo Montero. Sorry, everybody, technical difficulties. I'm sure we will be right with you.
Yeah, sorry about this, guys. So what is it? H2D2 admin?
I will send you an email. You respond.
I mean, can you guys see me like typing in my email right now?
No, the only thing we can see is the Blue Jeans events.
And my desktop background, though. Yeah. Like it's not just focused on the thing, right? Like it.
Yeah, we can see your background, but that's it.
Okay, I have just sent an email to you from h2d2.university.michigan@gmail.com. So if you respond with your slides, I will make this happen.
Doing it now. Kind of weird that. So I won't be able to scroll through the slides as I talk. Is that right?
You tell me next slide. I will make the next slide be.
Okay. But I should stop sharing my screen, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is the way of it. Okay, I am almost there. So now I will share my screen. Your screen. Sorry, 1 second.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you see that, Arthur?
I can see the slides, yeah. So can you guys, you can see my video, is that right?
Well, you see what I see, so maybe not.
Maybe not. Okay. I mean, it doesn't matter. You guys don't need to see my face, I guess. Okay. So is that okay? We're good with this?
Yeah.
We're gonna start. Yeah. Okay. So sorry for the difficulties, but thank you for having me, and thanks a lot also to the organizers. It can't have been easy to pivot at the last minute, but it's great that we're still able to do this. So okay, so this is a project that's still quite preliminary, despite the fact that we've been working on it for a really long time. This is joint work with Julian Dyer, who was a fantastic PhD student here and is now at the University of Exeter. Okay, so next slide. So, next slide, please.
Do you not? Sorry, I'm on slide 2.
Oh, I don't see that.
Eduardo,
Here we
do
go.
you see
There we
that?
go. Yep, I'm
I
on.
see slide 2. Yeah.
I see slide 2 now. Okay. Yikes. Okay. Hopefully this. Okay. So this is a project that's, I guess, motivated by this linguistic distance and linguistic diversity literature, where we get these pretty strong and robust negative correlations between ethno-linguistic distance or diversity and economic outcomes. So growth, institutions, et cetera. There's a variety of things that are I think are bad in diverse countries, and that's especially true when cultural distance is high. And because of that, there's been this interest in trying to understand how we can reduce cultural distance. This literature is largely focused on nation-building policies, but in this project, we want to think about what should we expect might happen naturally in the absence of these kinds of social engineering government policies. And so we're motivated to think about this in part by the sociolinguistics literature, which is, for the most part, arguing that convergence is an unintended byproduct of interaction. So the idea is that two groups interact with each other and they both absorb characteristics of the other's culture, and so you get this convergence that's a function of interaction. In economics, this isn't universally true, but for the most part, the literature has taken linguistic distance or cultural distance or linguistic diversity as something that's as good as randomly assigned, and that's, I mean, obviously strongly contradicts what they're thinking about in sociolinguistics. So we wanted to think about these two things as potentially competing hypotheses. Okay, so next slide, please.
It's done, but
okay. So why don't I think there's a big lag, so I'll kind of follow through on my slides at home. Okay, so so in this paper, I think the bulk of what we've done so far is to construct a new data set that's looking at linguistic convergence. So we have data that people have used, and there's really good work on looking at, like I said, cultural similarity. But to look at the process of convergence, we can't currently do that with the existing data. So what we need is to understand, I mean, if two groups are converging towards each other, which group is doing the adopting and which group is doing the influencing, and that's not data that, at least to our knowledge, exists. So we took some time to put that together. And so we now have a data set that measures at the pairwise group level the direction of language adoption and the influence of a language. So like in our case, it's going to be the linguistic influence of a language. And we're doing this by looking at and aggregating data on all known words in all known languages. We're going to focus on loan words, and I'll talk about that in a second. We want to think about how interaction might influence this cultural convergence process, and so we're going to match that to what we think is exogenous variation in two groups interacting. And so in particular, we're going to look at the gains from trade between any two cultural groups, any two ethno-linguistic groups. And we're going to try to think about the gains from trade as being solely a function of land characteristics. So we're going to focus on agricultural trade. And the intuition behind the measure that we're going to put together, we're just going to have a simple structural model that's going to estimate something along the lines of if my group can grow crops that produce nutrient A and not nutrient B, but I need nutrient A and B to survive, and then another group can grow crops that produce nutrient B but not A, then we should make natural trading partners, and the potential gains from trade are really big. So we're going to estimate production under different hypothetical trading networks to try to understand at a pairwise level how much each group is influencing or is improving the trade outcomes of each other group. Okay, so next slide. So what we find, so first, I guess what we find is that we're quite convinced that the bulk of the economics literature that takes diversity as good as random is likely not correct. So we find, I think, fairly strong evidence of endogeneity of linguistic distance. But we also find evidence that's not fully consistent with just this contact language hypothesis, which says that convergence is a function of a byproduct of interaction. So we have some thoughts on what we think is going on, which explains the bulk of the patterns in the data that we have. So we're thinking of this as individuals who face a set of trading partners who may speak foreign languages. They're strategically deciding which of those languages they would like to invest in at some cost. And then we're thinking about if enough people invest in a particular foreign language, then that foreign language may be diffused throughout the own language. So we're thinking about like an S-curve diffusion, just kind of completely typical diffusion in the literature. And so the kind of thing that's novel about this, over and above what the sociolinguistics are thinking about, is we have this strategic decision that individuals are making to bear some cost to invest in other languages. So next slide, please. So the big thing that that I think we're doing here is measuring this linguistic influence. So this is what we've spent kind of a good period of time on. And kind of the thing that we think is going to be helpful to the literature. So right now it's very difficult. I think it's impossible to think about cultural influence given the data that people have. We're going to try to resolve this challenge by looking at loanwords. So a loanword is a word whose meaning and sound are adopted by one language from another, and this actually makes up a surprising share of languages typically. 20 to 50% of languages are made up of loanwords. Typically, I'll show you the histogram in a bit, but typically a language is borrowing a loanword from between 3 and 15 neighbors. Next slide, please. So we're starting with a data set which is all known words, I should say, in all known languages. So this is a huge data set. This is coming from Panlex. It's giving us, Julian's going to kill me for saying this, but it's giving us, this is not the right jargon for linguistics, but this is giving us basically dictionaries for every language. So it's I think I wrote down the right way to say this, is the lexicon with meanings for every language. So we're interested in knowing at the societal level or at the language pair level, the share of words that are loanwords. The field of linguistics has identified a lot of loanwords, and so we're going to use all known loanwords as a training set to estimate for all of the other words. So this all words in all languages is about 25 million words. The field of linguistics has identified, and we're taking this as like known and given, they've identified loanwords for about 50,000 of those 25 million words in 41 different languages. This is coming from, for the most part, the World Loanword Database. We're supplementing this a little bit. We had a linguistics PhD student to fill this out and try to capture all known loanwords that just the field of linguistics has identified. And so we're using this 50,000 words that we're taking as known as a training set to estimate the remaining, almost 25 million words where we don't know the loanword status. So we're using just a random forest machine learning algorithm to estimate the number of words in each language that are either borrowed or loaned from or to any other language. Next slide, please. So this is a map of our training set. This is coming from the World Online Loans, the World Loanwords Database. So we have 41 borrowing languages in red, and then the blue circles are the source languages. Next slide, please. And the classifier performance. This is the accuracy of our random forest classifier. So we're getting loanword status right about 98 and change percent of the time. So that's the figure on the left here. But you can break this down into the different kind of groups that you might think about. So in the blue line on the right, that's capturing, that's I guess telling us that we match about 82% of all actual loanwords. So if it is a loanword, we're getting about 82% of them. The yellow line is telling you that when we do match, we get the direction right about 95% of the time. So we're not misattributing A borrowing from B as B borrowing from A with much frequency. The green line is saying that we essentially always assign non-loanwords to non-loanwords, where we're not making that mistake much at all, and we're almost never. The red line is saying that we're almost never assigning a loanword to the wrong source word. So I think we're doing actually quite well, surprisingly well, with the random forest, especially given that I think it's important, and I haven't mentioned that the classifier is only classifying words on the basis of the meaning and the phonetics and the structure of the word or the language itself. It's not using anything about group characteristics in order to do this, other than just the structure of the word itself. So we're really kind of encouraged by this. Next slide, please. And so if we take this data that we've kind of estimated on loanwords, and we aggregate that up to the group level, we're finding, consistent with what people say, about 20 to 50% typically of words are coming from another language. You get this big kind of spike to the left where lots of groups are not borrowing at all, but the bulk of them are kind of in this 20 to 50% range. Way out in the tail, in the right tail at one, these are like Pidgin and Creole languages, but they don't make up that much of our data. Okay, next slide, please. So this is we think pretty interesting. So this is just there's no causality going on here or anything like that. This is just the correlation between how much you lend to your neighbors or other languages around you and how much you borrow from them. So if we thought that this like contact hypothesis where language exchange was just an unintended byproduct of interaction, we might expect that these two things are positively correlated. We might think that as interactions increases, both I'm absorbing more from the person I'm interacting or the group that I'm interacting with, and vice versa, they're borrowing more from me, and so these things would be positively correlated. And the fact that they're not even just at the descriptive level, we think is really interesting and warrants some investigation. Okay, next slide, please. So we want to try to get something that we can say causally here. And so we're focusing on this incentive to trade measure, which again is really driven by the characteristics of the land that a particular group is on. So we're going to focus on local trade and agricultural production, and that's because we can use the land characteristics to reasonably estimate what might happen there. And we're going to assume in constructing the measure, the gains from trade measure that we want, that not dying is historically a good motivation for trade. So we're going to have a very simple agricultural trade model. We're going to have a utility function. I'm not going to take you through the whole model, but just to give you a flavor of what we do, we have a utility function based on production of various nutrients that are required to survive. And then we're going to estimate the gains from potential trade based on preferences over the importance of these nutrients. So this is going to give us the utility of a group for trading with their network, and then we can take out one by one various partners from that trading network to see what the new utility is without that group. And then the share of those two things is going to be the gains from trade for one group for any other group that happens to be in the trade. We end up with kind of a huge right tail where like you'll get a trading network of two groups that really depend on each other a lot to survive. And so to kind of deal with that a little bit, and also the challenges of thinking about utility units, we're going to facilitate interpretation on both of these dimensions. We're going to use the percentile rank and the distribution on this ratio that we come up with. Okay, so next slide. So the data. Let me just kind of check the time here. I'm running out of time. Is that right?
Yeah, you have like 3 minutes in total time. We started 5 minutes late, so we'll go 5 minutes over. But you have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, no, okay, so that's fine. So the data is from the FAO. I won't tell you too much about this. Eduardo already told you about this data. We use NIH data to get the nutrients. And then we're, again, the intuition of this is we're looking at nutritional complementarities. Next slide. So I'm on the map slide now. Again, I can't see what you're on, but there's a green map on the left and purple map on the right. So this is showing in green the share of languages that are comprised that are made up by loanwords. So this is like borrowing in green, and in purple it's gains from agricultural trade. And so just kind of eyeball econometrics, these two things look correlated. If you go to the next slide, you can see we do this in a little bit of a more rigorous way. And there's a strong correlation between, so in both of these graphs here, we have gains from trade with a neighbor. This is at the societal level. So this is gains from trade with your best neighbor on the x-axis. And then we have lending and borrowing on the y-axis. So on the left is borrowing, and on the right is lending. And now both of these things are positively correlated with interaction. So we don't want to throw out the contact hypothesis completely, but that's not the only thing that could be explaining this. So gains, my group A's gain with B and B's to A may be correlated with each other. Next slide shows a similar relationship, but taking the kind of flip. So instead of looking at the benefit of my neighbor to me, it's looking at my benefit to my neighbor, and we see fairly similar things. Okay, so some of what we find, so the next slide, so I'm on taking stock now. So some of what we find is that is consistent with the contact language hypothesis, some is inconsistent. We want to think about this rational individual adoption with diffusion. So there's a couple of implications of this kind of model that are distinct from a pure contact language hypothesis. One is that diffusion implies that if you have a ton of beneficial neighbors, then the adoption is going to be a little bit more fragmented, and you may not get the critical mass of any one language in order to have it diffuse. So we expect at some point potentially a negative relationship between the number of viable trading partners that you have and the benefit of and the diffusion, the adoption of that language more generally into your own. And the second is that if we're thinking about this as investments that individuals are making in other languages, then economic leverage may play a role. So you may expect that rather than the symmetric adoption implied by the contact language hypothesis, you might expect that if we're thinking about this as investments, that the group that benefits the most will be most likely to bear the cost of that investment. Next slide, please. So this is, again, just something that's descriptive, but it's looking at the number of beneficial neighbors that any group has on the x-axis and the share of the language borrowed or lent on the y. So the solid line is borrowing, the dashed line is lending, and you see that as you get more beneficial neighbors, the lending it's not quite linear, and I'm not sure it should be, but it's increasing as interactions are increasing. But you get this, at some point you cross this kind of threshold where it gets the investment that individuals are making gets fragmented, and you're not getting this critical mass required for diffusion within your own society. Next slide. So I'm on hypothesis 2 now. The next thing that's a little bit distinct is that from the contact hypothesis is that the contact hypothesis implies symmetric borrowing and lending, and what we find is evidence of asymmetry. So we find that asymmetry in economic leverage. So if one within a pair, if one group benefits more economically, then they borrow more and lend less within that relationship. So in column 1 here, we have fixed effects for both groups, but not the pair, and we find a strong positive relationship. But in columns 2 and 3, we're looking at pair fixed effects. So this is also controlling for a lot of things that you might be concerned about, like ruggedness or land heterogeneity or any of these things. Distance between the two groups, and we're still finding this really strong positive relationship. And because of the pair fixed effects, the implication here is that big gaps in gains from trade is generating big gaps in the share of borrowing. So the asymmetry in the trading relationship is generating asymmetries in borrowing patterns within relationship. Okay, so I'm almost certainly out of time or over, but I just want to kind of mention that we've put this data together that we think is potentially helpful in thinking about cultural convergence, and we find what we think are interesting patterns in cultural adoption and influence. That is neither fully consistent with the economics literature or the sociolinguistics literature, but certainly large elements of what the sociolinguists are talking about with this contact language hypothesis are showing up in our data, but that doesn't appear to be the whole story. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Thanks to the other presenters who joined virtually, but especially I just want to say thanks loads of people attending, but also the organizers. Really cool sets of papers, and yeah, hope you guys join other sessions today. So thanks everyone. Have a good day and stay safe.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.